In 2008, Zimbabwe printed a $100 trillion bill, not as a joke, not as a collector's item, as actual currency you were supposed to use to buy bread. Think about that. $100 trillion, a number so absurd it sounds like a punchline, and it was worth about $40. By the time it was printed, it was worth less than a bus ticket. This wasn't ancient Rome debasing silver coins over centuries. This wasn't Weimar Germany in the chaos after World War I. This was 2008, the age of smartphones and the internet. The year Facebook became mainstream and Barack Obama was elected president. A modern nation, with modern infrastructure, with educated professionals and functioning industries, saw its currency become so worthless that people carried wheelbarrows of cash to buy groceries. Prices doubled every single day, not every month, not every week, every 24 hours. And here's the part that should terrify you. This didn't happen because of war or natural disaster. This happened because a government believed it could print prosperity, that it could create wealth by creating money. And when that lie collapsed, it destroyed an entire nation's savings, an entire generation's future in less than a decade. If you think this can't happen in the modern world, you're about to discover how fast money becomes worthless when governments play God. This is the financial historian. Let's talk about the day money died in Zimbabwe. To understand how Zimbabwe destroyed itself, you need to understand what it was before the collapse. In 1980, when Zimbabwe gained independence from British colonial rule, it was one of Africa's success stories. The country had rich agricultural land, a diversified economy, and a relatively well-educated population. Zimbabwe wasn't just self-sufficient in food, it was the breadbasket of southern Africa, exporting maize, tobacco, and wheat across the region. The capital, Harare, was modern and prosperous. The country had functioning schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. By African standards, Zimbabwe was wealthy. Its currency, the Zimbabwean dollar, was actually worth more than the US dollar at independence. One Zimbabwean dollar equaled 1.5 US dollars. For the first decade, things looked promising. The economy grew, foreign investment flowed in, the government invested in education and health care. Zimbabwe seemed to be building something sustainable, but beneath the surface, problems were brewing. The government was spending far beyond its means. President Robert Mugabe, who had led the independence movement, was consolidating power. And the productive agricultural sector, mostly white-owned commercial farms that had existed since colonial times, was about to become a political target. Here's where the lesson starts, because Zimbabwe's hyperinflation didn't begin with printing money. It began with destroying the economy's productive capacity while pretending the wealth would somehow remain. In 2000, Robert Mugabe faced political pressure. His party was losing support. He needed a distraction, a villain, a way to rally his base. So he turned to race and history. Mugabe launched what he called land reform. The official story was that land owned by a small number of white commercial farmers, a legacy of colonialism, should be redistributed to landless black Zimbabweans. It sounded like justice. It sounded like righting historical wrongs. But here's what actually happened. The government seized thousands of commercial farms, often violently, without compensation. These weren't just taken from white farmers. They were handed over to Mugabe's political allies, military officers, and elites with no farming experience. The farms that had been producing food for the nation and exports for the region were suddenly run by people who didn't know how to farm. Production collapsed. The breadbasket of Africa started importing food. Think about what that means. A country that had fed itself and its neighbors for decades suddenly couldn't grow enough maize to feed its own people. Agricultural output fell by more than 60% within a few years. And here's the critical part. Mugabe's government didn't admit the mistake. They didn't reverse course. Instead, they blamed the farmers, blamed sanctions, blamed drought, everything except the policy that destroyed the economy's foundation. This is the first domino. When you destroy productivity, when you seize assets and hand them to people based on loyalty rather than competence, wealth doesn't just transfer, it evaporates. and no amount of money printing can replace real production. But that's exactly what Zimbabwe tried to do.
By 2003, Zimbabwe's economy was in crisis. Agricultural exports had collapsed. Foreign currency reserves were depleting. The government was running massive budget deficits. There were three options: cut spending, raise taxes, or print money to cover the gap. Cutting spending meant admitting failure. It meant reducing salaries for government workers, for the military, for the political elites who kept Mugabe in power. That was politically impossible. Raising taxes meant extracting more from an economy that was already shrinking. You can't tax prosperity that doesn't exist. So they chose the third option. They printed money. And they told themselves it would be fine. At first, it seemed manageable. Inflation rose to 10%, then 20%, then 50%. Prices were climbing, but life continued. People adjusted. Wages increased to match. The government kept spending, but here's the trap that every government in history falls into. Once you start printing to cover deficits, you can't stop. Because the more you print, the less each unit of currency is worth. And the less it's worth, the more you need to print to buy the same things. It's a death spiral. By 2006, inflation hit 1,000% annually. By 2007, it exceeded 10,000%. And by 2008, the Zimbabwean economy had entered true hyperinflation, a nightmare that most modern economists thought was impossible in the 21st century. The official inflation rate in November 2008 reached 89.7 sextillion%. Let me say that again, 89.7 sextillion%. That's a 7 with 22 zeros after it. The number is so large it stops making sense. What that meant in reality was that prices were doubling every 24 hours. What cost $100 on Monday cost $200 on Tuesday, $400 on Wednesday, $800 on Thursday. Within a week, it cost $12,000. Think about that. Every single day, your money lost half its value. So what does daily life look like when your money becomes worthless by the hour? Imagine you're a teacher in Harare in 2008. You go to work in the morning. Your salary is deposited into your bank account at noon. By the time you finish work at 4 in the afternoon, that salary has already lost a quarter of its value. You rush to the store, not to browse, but to spend it immediately before it becomes worthless overnight. You get to the store, and there are no price tags. The cashier asks a manager. The manager calls the owner. The owner checks the black market rate for US dollars and calculates a price on the spot. By the time you're done shopping, the price has changed again. People carried cash in wheelbarrows. Not as a metaphor. Literally. Stacks of bills too large to fit in a purse or wallet. To buy bread, you needed a pile of notes 6 inches thick. To buy a car, you needed a truckload of currency. Savings evaporated overnight. Pensions became worthless. Anyone who had worked for decades, saved carefully, planned for retirement, wiped out. The money they had trusted their entire lives became scrap paper. Workers demanded to be paid multiple times per day. In the morning, at lunch, and again in the evening, because waiting until the end of the day meant a 50% pay cut just from inflation. Businesses couldn't function. You couldn't set prices because by the time a customer paid, the currency had lost value. You couldn't import goods because nobody would accept Zimbabwean dollars. You couldn't plan anything because the future was unknowable. And the government's response? Print more money. Issue bigger bills. Act as if the numbers on the currency were the problem, not the destruction of real value. In January 2009, the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe issued a $100 trillion note. Let that sink in. $100 trillion printed on a single piece of paper. When it was released, it was worth about $40 on the black market. Within weeks, it was worth less than $1. By the time Zimbabwe abandoned its currency entirely in April 2009, the $100 trillion bill was a souvenir, a relic of a dead monetary system. But before you laugh at the absurdity, understand what that bill represents. It represents the final stage of a government's war against economic reality. It represents the moment when printing money stopped being a solution and became a symbol of total collapse. The government didn't print $100 trillion bills because they wanted to. They printed them because they had to. Because inflation had destroyed smaller denominations so completely that you couldn't carry enough cash to buy anything. A loaf of bread cost $50 billion. Then $100 billion. Then $500 billion. The government kept issuing larger bills, hoping that putting bigger numbers on paper would somehow create real value. It didn't. Because money is not wealth. Money is a claim on wealth, a unit of account, a tool for exchange. And when the wealth it represents disappears, when farms stop producing, when industries close, when productivity collapses, no amount of printing can conjure it back into existence. Zimbabwe eventually gave up. In 2009, they abandoned their currency entirely. Zimbabweans started using US dollars, South African rand, anything except their own money. The Zimbabwe dollar, once worth more than the US dollar, was officially dead. And here's the bitter punchline: even today, you can buy those $100 trillion bills online. They sell for about $10 each, as novelties, as collectibles, as reminders of what happens when governments think they can print prosperity. So who suffered from Zimbabwe's hyperinflation? And who escaped? The answer is always the same. The people who paid were ordinary Zimbabweans, teachers, doctors, nurses, small business owners, retirees. Anyone who worked for a salary, anyone who saved in the local currency, anyone who trusted the system. If you were a civil servant with a pension, that pension became worthless. If you had savings in a bank account, those savings evaporated. If you earned wages, those wages couldn't keep pace with prices. The middle class, the backbone of any functioning society, was destroyed, and the wealthy elites, many of them saw it coming. They moved money into foreign accounts. They bought US dollars on the black market. They invested in real estate, in gold, in assets outside Zimbabwe's reach. The people with connections to power, the ones who controlled access to foreign currency, profited. This is the pattern in every hyperinflation throughout history. The insiders protect themselves. The outsiders, the ones who play by the rules, who trust the system, are sacrificed. And Robert Mugabe? He stayed in power until 2017, living in luxury while the people he claimed to represent carried wheelbarrows of worthless cash to buy food. The lesson is brutal but clear: when governments destroy their currency, the people in charge rarely pay the price. They protect their own wealth. They shift the burden onto the population. And they call it policy, not theft. If you think Zimbabwe's hyperinflation is just an African problem, a unique case, a situation that can't happen in developed nations, you're wrong. Zimbabwe's collapse happened in 2008. Not in the 1920s like Weimar Germany. Not in the aftermath of a world war. In 2008, the same year the iPhone 3G launched. The same year the global financial crisis hit. The same year most people in the developed world thought inflation was a solved problem and Zimbabwe wasn't some primitive backwater. It had universities, hospitals, modern infrastructure. It had educated professionals, functioning banks, internet connectivity. And none of that mattered when the government decided to print its way out of trouble. Now look around today. The United States has printed trillions of dollars since 2008. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet exploded from under $1 trillion to over $9 trillion. The European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England. All of them printing, buying bonds, moneyizing government debt. The official story is that this is different. That modern central banks are sophisticated, that they have tools Zimbabwe didn't have, that inflation is under control, but the pattern is the same. Government spending beyond their means. Deficits covered by printing. Productivity stagnating while money supply expands. And central banks promising that this time, it will be different. Zimbabwe thought it would be different too. They thought they could print money to cover land reform losses. They thought bigger bills would solve the problem. They thought economic laws didn't apply to them. They were wrong. And when the crash came, it came fast. Within a few years, the Zimbabwean dollar went from functional currency to worthless paper. Prices doubled daily. Savings disappeared. The economy collapsed. If you think the United States, Europe, or Japan are immune because they're developed nations, remember that Rome was the most advanced civilization of its time. Spain was the richest empire when it drowned in inflation. Weimar Germany was one of the most sophisticated economies in the world. Wealth and technology don't protect you from bad monetary policy. They just make the fall more spectacular. So what do you do when governments around the world are following Zimbabwe's playbook? First, understand that money is not wealth. Wealth is real assets, real production, real value. Money is just paper, or worse, digits on a screen. When the printing presses run, money loses value. Real assets don't hold assets that governments can't print. Real estate, if you can maintain it. Commodities like gold and silver. Productive businesses that create actual value. Skills that let you generate income regardless of currency. These are the things that survive hyperinflation. Third, diversify across currencies and jurisdictions. Don't keep everything in one currency, in one country, in one system. When one fails, and history shows they all eventually fail, you need options. US dollars may be the global reserve currency today, but the British pound held that role for centuries before it fell. Fourth, recognize the warning signs. Massive money printing. Government deficits that never shrink. Central banks buying government debt. Inflation that authorities insist is transitory even as prices keep rising. These are not coincidences. These are the early stages of currency destruction. Fifth, don't trust promises. The Zimbabwean government promised the land reform would create prosperity. They promised the money printing was temporary. They promised inflation was under control. Every promise was a lie, and the people who believed them paid with their savings. The system is designed to protect itself, not you. When crisis comes, governments will print to survive. Central banks will monetize debt to keep the machine running. And ordinary people will watch their savings evaporate while officials insist everything is fine. Zimbabwe taught us that hyperinflation can happen in the modern world, with modern technology, in a matter of years. The United States, Europe, and Japan are running the same experiment Zimbabwe ran, just on a larger scale. The only question is whether you'll see it coming in time to protect yourself. In 2008, Zimbabwe printed a $100 trillion bill. A number so absurd it became a joke. Except it wasn't funny. It was a death certificate for a currency, for an economy, for the savings of millions of people who trusted their government. Zimbabwe didn't collapse because of war. It collapsed because the government destroyed productivity, printed money to cover the losses, and pretended that paper could replace real wealth. Teachers carried wheelbarrows of cash to buy bread. Retirees saw life savings become worthless overnight. Prices doubled every 24 hours. And the $100 trillion bill, once actual currency, became a souvenir you can buy online for $10. This wasn't ancient history. This was 2008. The age of smartphones. The age of modern economics. The age when central bankers insisted they had solved inflation forever, and yet, a modern African nation saw its currency die in less than a decade. From breadbasket to wheelbarrows. From prosperity to poverty. Because when governments play God with money, the people always pay. Right now, the United States has printed trillions. Europe has printed trillions. Japan has printed trillions. Central banks around the world are running the same experiment Zimbabwe ran. They just call it quantitative easing instead of hyperinflation. But the math doesn't care what you call it. When you print money faster than you create value, the currency dies. The only variables are how fast and how far you fall. Zimbabwe fell fast. Within a few years, a functioning economy became a case study in monetary collapse. And if you think it can't happen in the developed world, remember, every empire that fell thought they were different too. History doesn't repeat, but if you ignore it, it will crush you all the same. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers, I'll show you where to look.